All right, guys, today we're going to talk about the evolution of democracy in Athens. We know Athens for being a famous first democracy in the world, but it wasn't always a democracy. It went through other stages of government before it became the world's first democracy. When Athens started, it was an aristocracy. An aristocracy means that the nobles, the rich people, are the one who have all the power. During the aristocracy, to be a citizen in Athens, you had to be a man whose father and whose mother's father, your maternal grandfather, were both citizens. And during this time, there was an assembly, a group of people who owned land, who could influence the government, but they didn't have very much real power. Over time, people began to resent the fact that only the nobles, only the rich people, had power. And the people who had economic power, like merchants and soldiers and artists and farmers, were really upset about that and began to push for changes in the government. So along comes this guy named Draco. And Draco is not Draco from Harry Potter, but he made some penalties that were very harsh and did some things that don't seem very nice to us. So that's a good way to remember him because Draco is not a nice guy, right? So Draco from ancient Greece made a new law code that had very harsh penalties. But this was the first time in Athens that the laws had been written down, which meant that now the aristocrats couldn't change the rules anymore. And this was a good thing because at least you know what the rules are, even if you don't like them. This should remind you of Mesopotamia, right? Hammurabi's code is super harsh, but at least it's better than not knowing what the rules are. We use the word draconian today to refer to something that's very cruel and severe. So that's where that word comes from Draco of ancient Athens. After Draco, there came another guy named Solon, who was appointed the chief official. That meant he was kind of like the most powerful person in Athens, but he wasn't the president. He didn't have that kind of power. In 495 BCE. And he did two big things to start with. He outlawed debt slavery, so you couldn't become a slave because you owed somebody money anymore. That made people happy. And he made the higher offices, the positions in the government that were up high, that were the most powerful, accessible to more people, not just those people whose father and maternal grandfather had been citizens. He gave the assembly, that group of individuals who advised the government, more say. And he encouraged the people of Athens to trade with other city-states, to export their goods other places. And that brought them more economic power. However, there's still not very many citizens, and there's still really only the wealthy people holding offices. More people came along and changed the democracy even more. Citizen was expanded to anyone who was free and male and born in Athens. That's a big change. Someone created the Council of 500. This was a group of 500 people who carried out the day-to-day business of the government. And the assembly was given more power. They were given the power to make laws. So now the individuals of Athens who served in the government could make laws for the government, not just the high-ranking government officials, which meant that lots more people had the ability to influence the rules of the city-state. For a period of time, there were a group of people in Athens known as tyrants. And tyrants were basically people who made reforms that the aristocracy didn't like. Okay, they were single individuals with lots of power, but they became known as tyrants. And we think of tyrants as being a bad thing, as somebody who has too much power and uses it in a bad way. As people who made reforms that the rich people don't like, is the way that we define that in ancient Athens. So time goes on, and eventually we come to our democracy in Athens. And the democracy consisted of a couple of key groups. One was the assembly, which is now made up of all citizens in Athens who are more than 30 years old. The assembly can make laws, it can pass policies, and it can collect taxes. That's important because it means it has the money. There was also the Council of 500. To be on the Council of 500, your name got picked out of a lottery and you served for 1 year, and they could propose laws that had to be passed by the assembly, and they still ran the day-to-day business of the city. Here is a picture from today of what the area where the ancient government of Athens was held met. Back here in the back, you can see this area called the Stoa. This is where people would gather and give speeches. These foundations of buildings are the remains of where the council and where the assembly would have met. And this is an open area. These buildings weren't closed. Remember, we said people in Athens did almost everything outside. And the marketplace where they would come to buy and sell things was very nearby. All of these things happened together. And just off to the side over here is the Acropolis. Here's another view of those foundations of the government buildings. The assembly had one more special power, and that was the power of ostracism. Once a year, the members of the assembly could vote to exile anyone they wanted from the city of Athens. They needed at least 6,000 votes to exile someone, and the person who had the most votes had to leave Athens for 10 years. This is different than any other part of Athenian law. Everything else was majority rule. This was very specific. You were kicking somebody out, you were doing it for 10 years, so you needed to have at least 6,000 votes to kick them out, and only one person could get kicked out every year. How did they vote? They voted by scratching people's names into leftover broken pieces of pottery. And because they voted on ostracism using those pieces of pottery, we call those pieces of pottery ostraca. So you can see these are all ostraca that were used to vote out a guy named Themistocles. And if you zoom in closely on this picture, I don't know if you can do that on your computer, but if you do, you can see these all say Themistocles on them. And Themistocles was an Athenian general who had made some decisions people were upset with, so they got rid of him. Other people in the Athenian democracy are archons and the commander-in-chief. These were people who were in charge of the government and had the main role in the military. They were elected by the assembly. They were sort of steering policy, what laws were going to be passed, and they were in charge of the military. So they were kind of like our president today, but they were a group of people. And then there were some other government officials, and those jobs were chosen by lottery, and you would serve in it for 1 year. That's good because everybody gets to serve, but it's not so good because what if you get people who aren't so great at that job, right? Ancient Athens had trial by jury, just like we do today. Juries were made up of 201 to 1,001 people. You had to have an odd number so that you could never have a tie. The juries didn't all have to agree, it was just by majority. So if you had a problem, you would go before the jury. So all of these are really positive changes. More people are being included in the government. More people get a say. So this is all a good thing and moving towards a government that really allows everybody to participate. But there are still some people who don't have any say in Athenian democracy. That means anyone who's not a citizen. And anyone who's not a citizen means all women, any men who are not born in Athens, and slaves. And it's important to remember that even though slaves had a wide variety of treatment, some had a pretty cushy life, some had a really hard life, slaves, no matter what, had no rights or personal freedoms. Not a perfect system, but closer to what we think of when we think of free government, and definitely the world's most open government at the time it was created. So that's your review of Athenian democracy. You should also have done your classwork assignment, reading the textbook and answering questions about the development of Athenian democracy. If you have any other questions, you should come and ask me in class. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.